So again, welcome to the event breakout for endurance. My name's Liz Davis, and I kind of lead on the talent pathway development for endurance. Today we're going to have a kind of interactive session, hopefully, on basically looking at competition to support in endurance development. Couple of housekeeping things just before we start. So just pop yourselves on mute. I think everybody's pretty much on mute unless you're planning to be interactive, which I hope we are at some point. As I said, we want to really push the interactive element of this session. So if you do have any questions as we go along, we will obviously do time for questions at the end. But obviously, if there is any questions on any particular slides, just pop your question in the chat. Zoe will monitor that, and obviously we can answer things as we go along as well. As I said, there will be, I haven't shared my screen yet, there's going to be a few interactive elements where we're going to get you into kind of breakout groups. So what I would suggest prior to going to the breakout groups, we'll be giving you a question or we're giving you a case study. So maybe try and take a photo or screenshot of that question so that you know what you need to discuss when you go into the room, okay? Because it's difficult. Zoe may be able to do it, but I'm not techie enough to broadcast that within the session. If Zoe works it out, fantastic. If not, just make sure you've taken a picture of that question or case study. Okay, as I said, recording the sessions, just let us know if you, if you don't want your picture or video to be in the final recording. Okay, just going to share my screen with you all. So again, as I said, we're going to be discussing through supporting athlete development through competition. Just a brief session overview then. So we're going to start with a group discussion on the benefits and challenges of competition. So I want you guys to have a little think about how you feel competition can benefit, but also potentially be a challenge for our developing athletes. I'll then talk a bit more about the role of competition in athlete development and looking at event specialisation, etc. Again, we'll have another group discussion on then the role of international competition, which again will be in breakout groups and then coming back together. And then we've got managing the competition calendar and some thoughts around that. And then some case studies at the end that will get you into groups to talk around framing competition experience. So that's kind of what the session looks like overall. And share that video with people attending. Okay, just moving on then. So what we want to look at first of all, just some questions for the group. So again, Zoe will put you in some breakout groups shortly, which we're only looking at a couple of minutes discussion, but I want in your groups to think about why is competition important for young athletes? And then the second question is, what are the possible negative sides of competition for developing athletes as well? So we're going to pop you into breakout groups and then we'll bring you back in. So if you can, in your breakout groups, discuss these questions and then nominate somebody who will feed back to the wider group. Okay, so Zoe, are you okay to pop people into the groups?
Everybody should be invited to a breakout session.
Room. So I won't reshare my screen in a minute because it's kind of nice to be able to see everybody to kind of get this discussion going. So I suppose the first question, and I don't know whether somebody from group one wants to feedback first around what we feel the kind of positive experiences or the benefits of competition for young athletes. I'm not sure who's nominated from the first group.
We didn't nominate anybody, but I don't mind speaking.
Oh,
it gives you a goal, it gives you something to achieve. So,
yeah.
And somebody mentioned the fact that this year there's been no competition and people have really missed it. And that's made me realise a sense of an event. So you put in your kit, you put in your running vest on, you put in your spikes on. Yeah,
I think that kind of competition. I think you mentioned there about the missing competition and probably the social side of competition for athletes as well. Our athletes, officials, coaches, I think that kind of certainly for young athletes, youth development athletes, that kind of social side of competition, yeah, is very important. Any other thoughts from anyone else around the benefits of competition for young athletes? Anybody from the second group, maybe?
I think it just gives people something to look forward to. You know, it is a big social thing, but also, you know, this is where you get your inspiration sometimes as well, in terms of, you know, how motivated you are to do well, to take part. You know, so it's a bit of a stepping stones process as well, isn't it?
Yeah. I think don't underestimate the confidence that people can get from competition. We'll talk a little bit about the you know, the downsides of competition, which I say downsides, the challenges of competition, but yeah, confidence building is definitely a key element of competition. If somebody meets a target, they do well, often that gives them a huge boost, and something certainly I've noticed amongst the athletes that I coach individually. Any other thoughts?
Yeah, in our group, we sort of said youngsters need a focus and potentially targets to aim for. Everything in life is a target, whether you need exams or anything in school. So it's a knock-on effect with that. You need targets. Obviously, you touched upon something to aim for. But achievement is the fundamental thing for the youngsters. They need something to achieve and to make them think they are fitting in and they're doing well at what they're currently doing.
Yeah, brilliant. Okay, just going then on to some of the challenges around competition, or I won't call it negatives as such, but possible challenges around how competition can be seen by young people. Again, any thoughts on that from either of the groups?
Well, it's quite difficult for children, you know, if they consistently come last, or, you know, I think, you know, the negative impact of that is, oh, I don't want to take part anymore because I'm making a fool of myself, or I'm not as good as my friends. In our group as well, we also talked about, you know, the impact parents and coaches can have on kids as well. You know, and there's been, you know, some cases that I've been personally involved in where, you know, it's been a bit of a safeguarding concern because children are crossing the finish line in absolute floods of tears because they haven't met their parents' or their coaches' expectations.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point there, Lisa, of who's actually setting the expectations in competition, and is it actually the athlete themselves, or is it the external people who are around that individual athlete? And yeah, that kind of extra pressure from, as I said, I'll try and see if I can share that video at some point, but that extra external pressure can have a very negative effect on the way athletes perceive competition, and their willingness to want to compete and be part of you know, any type of competition. Any other thoughts on the kind of negatives, anyone else? Or the challenges, I should say.
Doing too much too soon, as far as distance and speeds.
Yeah, so that
age-related. Yeah.
Yeah, that early event group, that early event specialisation, isn't it? And that kind of that outcome focus quite early on. And we'll talk a little bit about kind of event specialisation when it comes to competition in a while, in a bit now. But yeah, it's definitely something that, certainly one of the negative things, if you can be outcome focused early on, you do miss, and very specific in what events you compete in, you potentially could limit your you know, your progress. I think the best example of that is you know, the marathon yesterday, having a 39-year-old win the marathon trial, and where Chris Thompson's been throughout his career, and what events he's competed in, and the range of events just shows really that the stage of athletes that we deal with at the moment are actually very early on in their potential careers. So I think, yeah, that need not to be too specific too early is, and having that pressure too early is really important. Any other thoughts before I reshare my screen?
Yeah, a little bit that we added onto that, obviously pushing out a bit further, is pushing themselves way too hard. They're still growing at the minute, and obviously if you push them too hard, then the injuries start coming in, then the heads start dropping, then they get the problems then.
Definitely. And I think one of the things I'll touch upon shortly is endurance, not just in Wales but throughout the UK. It's probably one of the event groups that we have the most competition opportunities. Being honest, there's very little breathing space for rest from competition, and it's how we manage that as coaches as well is really, really important, because I think we can't often control what competitions pop up. However, it's having that kind of awareness of doing competition all the time is not always a benefit for your athletes. Yeah. Okay, I'll just reshare my screen a second. Okay, so we've just been through the group discussion, and thank you all for contributing to that. There's some really really good points come up from that. So again, just a recap on what you guys have been saying, because you pretty much come up with you know, most of the points around that. But it's often the reason, competition is often the reason why young athletes come into sport. They often maybe have competed in school, or they've done a competition where they've done quite well, and yeah, it's often the confidence that they then come into the sport via. It can be character building, like I said, it's confidence building. It gives them experiences they can take to other elements of their life as well. We can't get away from, we're on a performance, if athletes are looking at improving at performance, that it's an essential learning experience, really, competition. We can't shy away that athletes, if they want to compete and they have got aspirations to compete at a high level or any level within the sport, there's going to be competition. So it is that essential learning experience. And as a lot of you touched upon, it's that social environment as well for young athletes. So definitely loads of positives around competition. Again, possible negative sides of competition, you've again pretty much come up with most of the ones that I came up with as well, which is around this high expectations. Parents, coaches, athletes, even you know, include the NGB in that, really, of individuals who perform at a high level, or you know, where we're pushing the agenda rather than perhaps the athlete themselves. As I said, that comes with too much focus on outcome. As I said, packed competition calendar, no breathing space sometimes for, you know, that resetting, perhaps more of a focus on training, as we all touched upon, early specialisation. And I think one of the big ones for me that kind of you know, often affects a lot of young athletes in competition is this fear of failure. A lot of them worry about not doing well, they worry about kind of failing. So it's how we frame failure, or perhaps maybe not meeting targets. It can have a you know, a positive or negative effect on the athletes in front of us. So yeah, that's again just pulling that sort of together. And on the back of that, I think England Athletics did a study a few years ago looking at the rest and the drop off, and Zoe and I have shared these slides previously, but competition actually comes up a lot when it's when young athletes are asked, actually, why did you stop doing athletics? Why did you stop engaging in athletics? And again, as I say, things like my performance wasn't improving, the coaches were taking my, you know, performance too seriously. Those are things that come up quite often when athletes are asked why they disengage. So in terms of development, we're also looking at retention of these athletes as well by giving them positive competition experiences. Okay, so where does competition sit then in terms of this athlete development process? I mean, again, if anybody's tuned into some of the webinars I've done before, I look at the athlete, very much an athlete-centered approach to developing, whether it be an endurance athlete or any athlete in front of me. So competition really is part of that process of development. It's not the be-all and end-all of that athlete development process. It's one of the components we look to develop in our young athletes as they're moving through the pathway. And again, going back to what races are available to endurance athletes, I just wanted to put this slide up around, as we've already touched upon, the amount of opportunities that are out there. So this is a positive and a negative. I mean, the positive is there's probably something for everybody in endurance, especially, and within athletics. The downside sometimes of the numerous competitions that we have, including things like parkrun, which we wouldn't necessarily call a competition, but it's you know, often a competitive outlet for some athletes, is that there's actually a lot to kind of, as I said, it's often relentless throughout the year in the competition calendar. And I said those events can be organised by clubs, they can be organised by schools, NGBs, etc. And also even independent race organisers as well. So something like the Cardiff Half or the Swansea Bay 10K will often have a children's event within it as well. So there's lots and lots of these races available to endurance athletes. But when we look at events, the next thing we have a look at is event progression and specialisation. So there's a few athlete development models really which support kind of that event specialisation and progression. And obviously UK Athletics produced their endurance athlete development model, which looks at various developmental stages for athletes, both physical development, but also competition development as well. And I think the key thing that comes from this particular model really is thinking about that lack of event specialisation in the early stages. So when I say event specialisation, I mean discipline in terms of throws, jumps, etc. Trying to keep things fairly multi-event in those early stages of that athlete's career. As we all know, there's huge benefits to that in terms of, if we want steeplechasers, we need hurdlers. We want people who can finish faster than 800 meters. We need people who can sprint. Okay, so there's definitely that focus early on in that athlete's career, even up to that kind of point as they've gone through puberty, where you can still keep a broad range within that athlete's competition program. As they move then through kind of those stages from 16 upwards, there may be events that they prefer or they're more suited towards. However, I would always have the caveat there that keeping that range across numerous events during competition will support their development as they move forward. And I think looking again at ranges of athletes at senior level, you don't get many 10K runners who compete at a high level now who haven't actually got very good 1500 meter times. So again, it's that speed, that power development that we really need to ensure that we don't lose with our young athletes, because there will be athletes who naturally will gravitate towards a longer distance because they feel they haven't got natural speed. But there's still that conversation of, okay, well, you do need to have a certain speed level to compete, and actually it will support your development in the longer distances as you move forward. So again, it's looking back at that process as well as just focusing on that individual event. So my pet hate is having somebody who's 14 who is deemed an 800 meter runner, because automatically that language limits that athlete moving up and down distances as they go through the system. So I quite like that athlete development model. That's available via UK Athletics as well. I can share that with you. This is also supported, again, one of the things I've shared previously in my presentations is the youth physical development model. So this model was devised by John Lloyd and Roger Oliver at Cardiff Met University. And what, again, they've looked at is stages of development and what physical qualities we can develop in athletes at different age groups. And again, we can use competition to support athlete development in the sense of, as I said, if we've got this big window of opportunity between between early childhood to adolescence, where you can really maximize those qualities of agility, speed, power, strength. So if your athlete is going quite high up the distances and doing longer distances very early on, not only would you then limit their ability to perhaps move on in those events further on down the line, but you're also perhaps limiting their development within those certain qualities I just touched upon as well. So again, just to recap on that, I think at the stage of athletes that we generally deal with, a broad range of events, especially at the early event group stage, is really, really important. Speed and power development, again, is something that we can support through competition. Even in what we would call endurance athletes, they still need those qualities, and it's often the limiting factor as athletes move through the system if they haven't developed it. And then again, allow your athlete to experience a wide range of disciplines. So as I talked about in that slide before, there's actually lots and lots of options available within the endurance event group that your athlete can kind of have a go at. So there's usually an event for everyone, but also I've had a conversation recently with one of my athletes who she doesn't like track because she doesn't think she's fast enough. And I'm like, okay, but actually track will benefit you. She actually enjoys things like mountain running. She enjoys kind of, you know, longer distances, maybe 3K, 5K. And I've sort of said, well, actually by doing some of the shorter distances and keeping your event range broad, you probably will improve at the distances you enjoy as well. So it's kind of how we're framing that with our young athletes. On that note, one of the things that we often see as well with a very outcome focused kind of approach to youth development is kind of a preoccupation with times and preoccupation with Power 10, where I'm ranked on Power 10, you know, where I was last year on Power 10. I'm not knocking the Power 10 system. What I am saying is that there can be this preoccupation with times, and as I'm sure you're all aware, tactics within endurance is an important element of our event group, and what we could call that is learning our craft, learning how to run, learning how to race, and that's an important competition focus as well for athletes at this stage. It shouldn't all be about dropping into a BMC event or a local paced event to try and get a fast time. There's a time and a place for that, but there's also this need to learn how to race as well. And I think the best example that comes up recently is Piers Copeland, who's recently affiliated to Wales, and he was competing at the European Indoor Championships. On paper, he was 11th fastest in the field out of 13. So if you just went on time, he would have been 11th in the final. However, he finished 5th. And again, the reason he finished 5th, because he was able to tactically run that race to a level where he could execute a good finish, and he knew where he needed to be within that race as well. So I think that's a really good example from perhaps a higher level than we deal with, but where tactics are very important, and teaching athletes that as well. And again, I think certainly going back to that speed and power development, learning to finish quick is really important. So again, neglecting speed power development is going to mean that you're unlikely to have that quick finish. And again, for some athletes that might not genetically come easy to them. However, we want to maximize as much as we can that ability for that athlete to have a strong finish, because a lot, again, if we look at tactics within races, we often see that races wind up and then there's quite a quick finish as well. So again, if we're just running gun to tape with a pace, a set pace, splits being very even per lap, then again, we're possibly going to be limiting our athletes' ability to deal with those kind of tactical situations. So again, from a learning perspective, development perspective, think about, you know, your times and your tactics, basically. Okay, so this brings us to the next, so just omitting somebody, the next breakout group around international competition. Okay, so just some questions for you to think of within your group. So we'll set you up in a second. So does international competition keep young athletes in sport? I know we all deal with a broad range of athletes, but some of us will have athletes who have had international vests or aspire into that. So does it keep young athletes in sport? At what age should we have international competition? And the last question to have a think about is, how do we make international competition a positive experience? So Zoe, if you don't mind just popping everybody back into breakout rooms, and then we will have discussions amongst, just fire out there. So first question was, does international competition, do we feel it keeps athletes in our sport? Discuss. Any thoughts?
I was in a group with Kyle and Greg, and unfortunately, all three of us haven't had any experience of international competition. So, you know, we found it really difficult to be able to contribute to this session. Sorry, Liz.
No, not at all. Pete, I think you were just about to say something, I think, when you...
Yeah, so I think it's a bit of a mixed bag. I think it, you know, it works for some people, and I think what we discussed is that is very important. It's kind of that carrot, isn't it? Carrot for juniors to go after.
Yeah, so it's definitely a carrot that can be dangled there. I think when you look at retention in sport, again going back to that kind of athlete development, most of the reasons why athletes stay in the sport often is not always related to having an international vest. So I think it's considering again the appropriateness and the timing of that international vest, and sometimes the pressure that can put on athletes. So any other thoughts on, does it keep athletes in the sport?
Just to emphasize, I think it is a double-edged sword, isn't it? You know, it can be that carrot, but it can also be that too much pressure on themselves to make that team, and then if you make that team, then they feel like they failed, and then we go back to expectations and managing those expectations, and before you know it, you're losing athletes because they're not making Welsh teams, for example.
Yeah, it goes back to that kind of performance, when things get quite performance orientated. The flip side of that is obviously as athletes move through the system, there is a need for them, if they are of a certain level of performance, to experience international competition, because it's a really, really good learning experience for those athletes, because if you never have experience of international competition till say you're under 23, for example, you're really going to struggle to maybe kind of, you know, be able to cope with what that kind of pressure of that type of competition can bring as well. So yeah, definitely a double-edged sword. Any thoughts on the age that we should start international competition?
We spoke in our group, and again, you know, like Lisa, we didn't really have much experience of it. You know, I was talking about the only experience really that I've come across is through the schools, you know, through SIAB and the international, which, you know, and that is, I think it's just under 15s and up, isn't it? It's actually not the year 7 and 8. I think it's when they go into 9, 10, 11 plus, you know, which is, I mean, yeah, it's a good, it's, you know, certainly with the cross country, with the track and field and that, you know, it is something great to work towards, and it probably is pitched at around about that good age and things like that, you know. And also with it being through the schools, there just seems to be something a little bit less pressure on it, if you know what I mean. It's so no, that's it. I think the only other one we did, you know, was the London Mini Marathon selection for international teams. I mean, that used to be school selection, didn't it? But now Welsh Athletics are involved a little bit there. So yeah, but that was about it. But again, you know, that's under 15s and up, which it's, I think it is, but you know, again, what we did say was that the under 15s age group, you've got such a variety of physical development. You've got boys that are under 15s that have got a full sort of the muscular development, you know, and where they are, versus boys that are still sort of like little strings with knots inside the vest, you know, like standing up against each other. So I guess, you know, it's there, but yeah, that's me.
Yeah, no, and I think actually the reason I bring it up really is because endurance, we actually have international competition a lot earlier than other event groups, and that's very historical, in that we have the kind of SIAB opportunity at under 15 in cross country, whereas in other event groups you would get international competition starting until that kind of under 17 age group. So it was just getting a flavour really of how people felt about how that kind of supported. So we're talking again about competition supporting athlete development, how international competition, I think Pete put it great, was it can be that double-edged sword. It can be a lot of expectation quite early. And, you know, I talk to a lot of coaches and parents and athletes who actually have achieved that kind of mini marathon vest. And actually it can be a real huge pressure on them. The expectation actually starts to weigh them down a lot. So, you know, I definitely think it's a learning experience. It's just, again, you know, too much focus on it again can be, and often I get asked in terms of development, why aren't you putting on more international competition? It's what keeps athletes in the sport. That gets said to me quite a lot, which my pushback is always, well, the evidence just doesn't show that. The evidence shows that kind of creating like environments where athletes will thrive, a focus on process actually can be the bigger influencer on that overall retention within our sport. Okay, well, I think we'll move on from that to that section. Just reshare my screen. Okay, so competition level progression, this is just my feeling on it. People may, beg to differ, and we can talk about that if we want to at a later stage. But in terms of the under 13, under 15, I think just keeping things fairly local to your region, to your club, encouraging that multi-event kind of focus still. Because as I said, that is where you need to be with athlete development in terms of developing those all-around movement skills, etc. And probably the main, having I know there's under 13 and under 15 Welsh Championships, but actually having probably the focus can move a little bit towards that, as I would say, under 15 rather than under 13. Then at under 17, we're looking at increasing participation in UK-wide competition, potentially. Again, this is always stage, not age, remember. So there may be athletes who have to take a few steps back depending on when they've come into our sport. You can maybe start to introduce those kind of more paced timed races. And it may be that the top end of that under 17 age group can start to look at those kind of age group championships, say in England and further afield. So you're starting to broaden that kind of, development of that athlete's experience. I think for me, international competition focus, really, I would probably, even though there's opportunities further down the line, I really wouldn't put the huge focus on that till maybe they start to move through to that under 20 age group, where, if they're at that level, that's where you can have that more focus on making those international teams. What I would say, however, though, is if an athlete comes into the sport at a later date or they're a late developer, then there's examples of athletes who don't achieve an international vest until they're in their mid-20s or they're even as late as in their 30s. And we've got athletes, as I said, in that kind of more masters age group who are still getting into Olympic teams, for example. So again, that's just an athlete maybe who's moved through the system from having been in the sport of a year at an early age. Okay, so managing the competition calendar. Again, this is something that we won't spend too much time on, but I just wanted to give you an example of, like, say, what you might see in terms of a program over, say, the winter. And this may be with an athlete who's been in the sport a few years. They might have these competitions on the weekend. So that, to me, at the moment, looks a very measured competition calendar. The reality of what we normally see, however, is this. And they've maybe got races that you're not aware of. They've then got perhaps things like parkrun that they're doing on a Saturday. They're playing other sports as well as doing their athletics. So I think competition, again, needs to be weighed up against all these other components that athletes got to deal with in their daily life, and also the other, the other opportunities that get thrown at them as well. So I think managing the competition calendar, as I said, races are plentiful. One of the ways to look at that is to try and plan ahead, have that dialogue with your athlete about what they want from competition as well. Know your athlete in terms of other activities. So if they're playing other sports, etc., and there's an expectation to be doing competition as well, a lot in athletics, then again, it's likely to result in them kind of not performing as well as they could, or perhaps getting very tired. Again, there's always the question, if you're doing comps all the time, is where do you fit in your training? Where do you fit in that process, that development of the qualities we know that athletes need to continue moving through the system? Again, seeing this too often, especially in endurance with our relentless calendars, is burnout and fatigue if not managed properly. And the potential is also, as we've all talked about, to come to outcome focus. So I think you need to know your athlete, you need to know what competitions, if possible, are coming up, and thinking about that any competition needs to be aligned to that development level of that athlete as well. Okay, last thing we're going to talk about before we go on to the case studies is framing competition experience, because I think how we frame competition to athletes really can help them want to continue doing competition, but also can ensure that any negative experiences do not affect their continued participation in the sport. So first of all, we'll talk about when things go well, because that's kind of the easy one. So this might be a PB or a win or a higher placing. And as we talked about from the start, confidence building. So when something like that happens, the athlete's beaming. It's when they walk off the track, they're chatting to you, they're happy, and we know that they'll get some confidence from that. So that's great. I think even in that sort of scenario, though, discussing what went well with the athlete to help bank those positive experiences will help them kind of use some of the good things they've done in that competition for another competition. So again, you're talking about that kind of learning experience. I think always when you've got an athlete who's constantly doing well for a period is managing expectations on future success as well. Usually the path in anything in life, be it athletics, exams, work, etc., is normally a bit of a bumpy path. So it's ensuring that we don't set our athletes up to fail in terms of that expectation that things are they're always going to win, or they're always going to keep beating their PB or meeting their targets. So it's just, I say, we don't want to burst their bubble when things go well, but we also need to kind of ensure that we manage expectations as well. Okay, when things don't go so well, though, this might be not achieving a set target or an outcome in terms of placing or a PB. I think, again, we've just got to keep looking for positives in those situations. So even though they may have not had the best race in their mind, what was positive? What went well in that race? Did they have a strong start? Did they finish well? Did they keep good form within that race? So again, you're breaking that race down a little bit into process as well. Learn from the experience. Competition at any level, but especially at youth development level, is a learning experience. I think, ensuring that the athlete as well, when they've had a negative experience, doesn't focus on the uncontrollable. So often you get an athlete who goes, oh, well, they go on to the next race and, oh, that person beat me in the last race, or that course, I didn't like that course, and they focus very much on those uncontrollables. So one of the ways of getting around that with athletes is to think of the things they can control and the things they can't control, and maybe getting them to write down the things they can control, and then the things they can't control, like the competitors, other people's tactics, whether the weather's going to be bad, etc. They park those because it's not something they can actually control. And I think not dwelling on that experience is really important as well. So actually, yes, you want to learn from it, but you don't want to be defined by it either. So again, moving on to the next one, really important. Okay, so we've got only a short bit of time, so we may run over a little bit. I do apologize. So we've got some case studies, which I'll show you shortly. So we've got 3 athletes, and I want you to think about in your groups, what are your observations about the competition experiences of the athletes? Consider how you consider how you manage the competition requirements experiences of these athletes. What I would say is, if you don't do the case studies you don't do today, or you maybe take them away and have a think about how you deal with those situations as well. So it's going to pop you again into 3 breakout groups. Okay, so room 1 are going to be focusing on case study 1. So I don't know if you want to take a quick picture of that case study, so you can work through it.
Room 1's going to be Greg Allen, Kyle Perry and Lisa Nichols.
Great, thanks, Zoe. So you guys have got case study 1. Case study 2 is going to be room 2. You're going to be focused on Jack.
That's Alison Hurd, Mel Morris and Pete Ryder.
Brilliant. So again, take a bit of a screenshot of that, or take a photo on your phone. And then we got case study 3, obviously room 3.
And that's David Baugh, Ellen Baugh and Emma MacArthur.
Brilliant. Okay, so this is going to be talking a little bit about Caris in her experience. Okay, guys, we'll pop you into the rooms, and yeah, we'll reconvene in about we'll look at maybe 5-10 minutes. We got very little. So again, just for everybody to see what we're going to talk a bit about Jess. So again, I don't know if somebody from group 1, so Greg, I don't know if you want to feedback about your thoughts about Jess in terms of what your observations are and experiences, and consider how you'd manage your competition requirements as well.
Yeah, for us, we sort of said, well, it's that awkward, delicate age. there could be many other things going on outside athletics. Let's say she got a partner or things are happening that way. The other thing we discussed as well is, did she give everything all in to get our Welsh Fest? And then this season, she could be exhausted. She might have given everything. Maybe she's not hitting those peaks that she needs to hit and that kind of thing. And we sort of touched on the fact that it's a delicate age. Like, I have 15-year-old twin girls and it's difficult. I'm lucky they push each other. But when the hormones set in, it can be so much fun. So it was a delicate balance, to be honest. And we sort of discussed it that way, to be honest.
Yeah, no, I 100% agree with that. And I think it is a delicate age. It's often an age as well. One of the reasons I brought Jess up is because girls often develop quicker than boys. So you can see them having that, maybe that early success, and then they kind of sometimes get to a bit of a plateau, which is often what we see across especially in endurance. And I think it's important that when this happens with an athlete, because obviously it seems very outcome focused with Jess as well, is that we start to wind it back a bit, sort of review kind of the processes around things and sort of shift her focus a little bit from just around competition. Because again, that retention thing we looked at around staying in the sport, etc., and continued progression in the sport, is if we don't do that, that's when athletes become very performance orientated and we may lose them from that. And you know, she talks a lot about, doesn't she, she was beaten by people who beat her last year, and again, she may be an early developer, as you said, 16 years old, she's probably got exams, etc. So yeah, lots of different challenges there. Just check the chat a second. Someone just put something in the chat. Yeah, so okay, just moving on then to the second case study. So this is Jack. Obviously he's quite a high performing 14-year-old, and yeah, so I don't know, Alison, do you want to feedback around your observations there?
We more or less said this is sort of a classic example of somebody that might burn out too quickly. Seems to be maybe himself and his father putting a lot of pressure on everybody, on Jack. So maybe we thought sort of work with the parents, give them carrots, give them some competitions, but also maybe look at the strength and conditioning. So he's been a more rounded athlete at 14. Another idea we came at, was there a role model or a mentor, somebody who was an athlete now that could work with him, and somebody that maybe, you know, was in the same situation. But obviously if he's number 2 in the UK, he's looking at being a good junior rather than looking at the long-term international plan.
Yeah, 100%. I think it's that long-term progression again, isn't it, with maybe a potentially precocious youngster, and sort of managing again those expectations. And I think when in these kind of scenarios is sort of describing, I mean, there are examples out there of precocious teenagers who've done well at the moment. However, for a lot of athletes, they don't develop to their full potential, and especially in endurance, until they're in that kind of late 20s. And again, I keep quoting about Tomo, but winning the marathon trial at 39. So we need to prepare the athletes for a life in the sport, not just like early wins. And I think as you talked about here, we see this potentially a lot where we've got kind of external influences as well on that child. And maybe, are these Jack's expectations, that what he wants to do, or are we seeing somebody else kind of potentially driving those, you know, that kind of outcome focus, really, maybe a parent, etc., or a coach. And as I said, it's very outcome focused, very pace time focused. So again, I would be questioning with Jack a little bit around, okay, you all you want to do is to get on top power 10. What about your ability to race tactically, etc.? So you're stripping it back again to that kind of more process focus. Right, okay, so last one was Karis, who's obviously a late developer, which we do see coming into our sport. So David, from group 3, what are your observations and kind of how would you manage this sort of situation?
Well, one of the first things we thought we need to ask some questions. So why does she think she's not fast enough? She's just got into athletics, so how does she know she's no good on the track? That's one thing. And we also thought that this idea of the 5K and parkrun are linked, that you know, so many youngsters do parkrun and have comparative success in parkrun. You know, get a top 3 place in parkrun, it's quite easy. And then you go to a road race, it's actually a very different thing. The competitions are a lot harder. So we need to do a bit of investigation, I think, to find out why it is she wants to do 5K. But we come back to what you were saying, Liz, earlier on. Actually, if we can encourage to do the stuff on the track, it will help the 5K anyway. So, you know, say, well, if you want to do 5K and you're convinced that's what you want to do, well, why not do some 800, 1500 work, and that will improve your times.
Yeah, definitely. I think, again, it's an athlete who's come late into our sport and potentially has, you know, if she's shown a little bit of ability, you know, could end up progressing in the sport. So it's almost stripping it back, isn't it, to what actually does Caris need in terms of her development at this point. As you rightly said, David, keeping that competition very broad. Again, this is really common that you see this amongst athletes who haven't got a natural turn of speed, that they think they're suited to the longer distances, which they probably are. However, it's putting those limitations too early on you know, not developing the other components which we know will allow them to accept load, create power. And as I said, the speed that races, club, regional, national level move at now, you've got to be able to turn your legs over. So I think, yeah, definitely having that conversation with Caris and trying to reassure her that, you know, even if she perhaps isn't the fastest on the track in terms of the 1500, it will massively benefit her to kind of improve her times or improve her ability to run in that kind of race for the longer distances. So yeah, just some kind of things to try and bring what we've talked about to life there, really. So just as a recap on what we've talked about, I think competition, I hope it hasn't come across too negative around competition, because it's a really, really important part that supports our athlete development. I think the key messaging to get across here is just think about the choice of competition, the level that your athlete's at, and the most important thing when working with youth development athletes is we keep that competition program nice and broad. As I said, I go back to that age-old thing, that where do we find steeplechasers from if we haven't got hurdlers? And you often see that people default to certain events rather than kind of, you know, looking across the whole spectrum of what they could do in endurance. There's loads of options in endurance. We are a very lucky event group, and we've got loads of different opportunities. There usually is an event for everybody. So it's about your athletes experiencing as many of those events as possible. I'm wholly aware of the time, that you've got another session that you need to get to in probably about sort of 5-10 minutes. Are there any burning questions that anybody wants to bring up? I'll stop sharing my screen a little bit, or any observations anybody wants to kind of bring up before we close. Anything from your own experiences or?
I mean, my only input would be this park runs have become a real problem. They're a great tool, but in many ways you get so many young athletes just racing them every single Saturday morning. Obviously not a problem at the moment with COVID, but you know, when they do start, I do find that a lot of athletes are just over racing.
Yeah, I think you're right there, Pete. It's as I said, that was where that slide, which I did rush through a little bit, where it showed sort of what you see an athlete do and what they actually sometimes in reality do. And you know, they see parkrun, and parkrun often for a youth development athlete as well, they turn up and they want to race it, they want to get a fast time, they want to get, again, you've got the rankings thing on parkrun. And I'm not taking anything away from parkrun. Parkrun has probably been one of the best concepts developed in sort of health and fitness in the last few years, but I think for sure it can become you know, that's something that athletes, you know, end up doing a lot of. And yeah, I mean, it's just, again, managing that. It can be used, you know, positively again. It's just making sure that you look at the overall calendar and what the loading of the athletes been across that period as well. Okay, any other thoughts? Probably wrap it up in about a minute.
I just asked a question about age groups. You know, for example, in cross country, age groups are based on a date, usually in September, and that does perpetuate problems in that you have kids who can be 11 years, 11 months difference in age in the same race. And that there is research that shows that actually that does perpetuate through the age groups, because someone is really good at the under 11 age, yeah, and then they are nurtured and pushed on. Is there a way around that somehow?
it's a difficult one, isn't it? Because you have to have a cut-off point for an age group. If you know, if we have to move to something like boxing where they went on sort of size and weight rather than kind of like age, because we're very chronological really, and a lot of sports are, to be honest. And I'm not sure that's to our advantage. That would be a minefield to change, just because it's so entrenched within our thinking from, well, across sports really. But it's a really, really good point, David. And I think that's what comes down to managing your athletes' expectations, in that if you've got a young athlete who is late developer in there, because even within a year group, you might have somebody who's born in August who's actually quicker developer than somebody born in September, for example. So, you know, it's not always down to chronological age. But I do, as I said, it all comes down to how we frame competition, how we, you know, that focus again on process. I always go back to that rather than it just being all about outcome, because as you said, things change so much in these junior years, and you know, and people, there's lots of bumps along the way, and I think it's important that our overarching aim is, especially in endurance, where we are, as I keep going back to, a late development event, that we really, really, you know, try and keep those athletes there for long enough. And we have a huge issue in endurance with young female athletes. You know, I've done my own desktop research on it, and we lose a lot of athletes in that under 17 age group, under 20. The numbers go down significantly when you have to look on Power 10. So I think it's, you know, it is a problem, but I said some of the, hopefully I've given you some strategies today that you can go away with to try and manage some of those issues around competition. Okay, guys, have to stop there. I know you've got to shoot. So